Yeah. Hi, and we are live. So, hi everybody, Merry Christmas, and welcome to this edition of Singy Talks. We're just doing a few admin things behind the scene, but I'd love for my guests to introduce themselves, and then I'll introduce Singy. So we can start with Darius.
Hi everyone, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas. My name is Darius Okola. I'm a researcher and a writer, mostly focusing on economics, but also my faith plays an integral part of my conversation, even in these issues. Yeah, so I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Msingi, for having me on board today on this conversation.
Karibu sana. Welcome, Christine.
Hello, my name is Christine Mungai. I am a writer, a journalist. I'm also curator of a media lab in Nairobi, Baraza Media Lab, where we do interesting and experimental projects and events whose aim is to strengthen the Kenyan media ecosystem. Carol is my friend, and thank you for extending this invitation. This is the second time I'm on Singy Talks, and I'm really happy to be back in this room. Excited about today's conversation. I spend a lot of time thinking about how my faith convictions can respond to my material reality and my political, the ecosystem that I live under. It's not as straightforward as it sounds, but it's something I grapple with a lot. And I'm happy to be in a space where we can grapple together and figure out something that will take us through a really difficult time and a difficult year it has been, but excited to close it out like this, talking about how we can integrate our convictions into this very normal holiday season, I think. Yeah.
Cool. Karibu, Christine, and I'm glad to have you again and again and again. Open invitation. And I am very excited to host my brother Nkosi. Nkosi, Karibu.
Hi everyone. My name is Ngosi Vumile Gola. I'm based in Cape Town. I work with the Warehouse Trust. It's also based here in Cape Town. We basically work with churches, helping the churches to respond to issues of inequality, injustice, poverty, and division. But also I generally love Black people. I think history has laid a burden on our shoulders, really to liberate the world. I think it is within our responsibility to give the world a human face. I think that's hugely lies on the African shoulders because we are, oppressed. Everywhere you go, the people whom you will see being oppressed are Black people. So that really puts that burden for liberation on us. So I love Black people. I love Black people. Yeah.
Thank you, Nkosi. And my name is Carol Nganga, the founder of Msingi Trust, and it's an honor to be here. And thank you to our returning friends. Thank you to the new friends who are watching this for the very first time. Please remember, if you have any questions, type them on that under there where the things are coming up, then the comment box. Also, remember that you can host a watch parties on your Facebook pages so that more people get to see this conversation. So let's do that. Tag the panelists, tag Msingi Trust, and we'll get to you. I'd like to introduce who Msingi Trust is for those who've not encountered us. So just give me a minute, I share this with us.
Advocacy and the Christian faith have in common? Is pursuing justice at all levels a spiritual discipline? How do we influence church leaders and what does social justice, activism, advocacy, and the Christian faith have in common? Is pursuing justice at all levels a spiritual discipline? How do we influence church leaders and Christians to advocate for justice and fight injustice? How can churches become the first line of defense for the socially unprotected? Msingi is a movement of people spurred by their Christian faith to answer these questions about social justice, advocacy, and activism. Msingi believes the church can be empowered to redemptively advocate for justice for the most oppressed, for those relegated to the fringes of society, for the disempowered, and those without access to power. In his inaugural sermon, Jesus spoke about those on the margins of society, about their freedom and their liberation. Pursuing justice is at the core of being a Jesus follower. Justice and righteousness is the foundation of God's throne. Msingi's name, call, heart, and bold mission draws from this, holding true to the tenets of God's kingdom. Our faith propels us to seek justice and spend ourselves on behalf of the poor. Justice is their shield and defender. At Msingi, we are about connecting the struggles that we all face. We are creating safe spaces to converse about social justice, curating content that enhances justice conversations, and in this way, uniting the stand for social justice and for advocacy. Engage the content, join in the conversations, connect to the movement. This is Msingi.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you, everybody. So this is us, this is Msingi. Please invite us into your spaces, allow us to have these conversations together. And today's conversation is definitely about Christmas, as we've shared. And I'd like us to dive deep into my panelists. We'll start with Darius because you're on the left, like that side of my screen. Darius, what's your first Christmas memory? And where were you? How old were you? What's that first Christmas memory that you have?
I can't remember what age it was, but then I remember my mom was still in school, so it was me, my dad, and my elder sister. And it was just us tying up the balloons, us doing, that whole coloring foil stuff and packaging stuff. Interestingly, of course, it was also one of my elder cousins and my uncle. And it's just interesting looking back the fact that for all that we did, for all the memories that, we built, then it was the relationship. It was this exclusive thing that you did at a certain point in, the year. And it's, the whole point of it, my dad.
Have we lost Darius?
In a bucket and stuff around it to keep it, farm and all that. And there's all these memories around it. Of course, on the material day, you go to church, you listen to someone, you come back home, there's all this music. And in many ways, it was just a celebration. It was a recognition that even if you didn't know the reason for the season, so to speak, that it was a moment you had to be a part of. It was something, materially, in terms of the celebration, in terms of the rituals, you just had to be a part of. I must have been like around 3 or 4 years old, and of course, it evolves over the years, and things change in what you do as a family tradition. But that is, for me, the most vivid of it all. It was me, my dad, my elder sister, one of my elder cousins, and an uncle of mine. So it was basically the 5 of us, and it was, that pretty much summed it up. It was the church, it was the balloons, it was the cypress tree, put it there, tie the boxes, and all that. And that pretty much captured it. Yeah.
You didn't get new clothes, Darius, in Christmas?
Surprisingly, I don't remember them buying me in that particular Christmas season. No. Of course, subsequent Christmases, there were the clothes and everything, but I don't remember for my earliest Christmas memory whether we really went for shopping. We were out there in the middle of nowhere. My dad had been posted way out of the cities and the towns, so we didn't have the wherewithal to go 60, 70 kilometers on some funny roads to the closest town. So we made the best of what we had.
Awesome. Thank you, Darius.
Yeah.
Asante. Christine?
Yeah, for me, I think my earliest memory is I was younger than 7. And my earliest memory basically just centers around the Christmas tree. For some reason, that was like, that is what made Christmas. There was no Christmas if there was no Christmas tree. A little bit later, like in my middle childhood, there are a few years, even going into like early teenage and high school, there are a few years where we didn't put up the Christmas tree. And to be honest, like it did not feel like Christmas at all. Like, to me, that was just any other normal day if it wasn't, accompanied by this whole tree and decorating the tree idea. Sometimes we had gifts on Christmas morning. I don't remember gifts being the thing that made it Christmas, but the tree definitely made it Christmas. Sometimes we would get big gifts. Sometimes we would just get like new clothes or little gifts or whatever. But for me, that was the major thing. Going to church on Christmas Day is something that I think started happening later in our lives, like teenage and after, and really connecting, the birth of Jesus, and, this whole thing was something I think that came after the whole hype of the Christmas tree and the gifts and the outings and all that. Yeah, that's for me what my earliest memories are.
Thank you, Christine.
One more thing.
Yes.
One more thing.
Yes.
Yeah. I bought a Christmas tree, and I put it up on 28th of November. Like, it has been Christmas for me for the past 2 weeks. As long as that tree is up, like, we are in festive mode.
It is Christmas from 28th November till
November.
Till
Like,
when?
we ushered in the festive season.
Yes.
And this was like the first time in my life I actually bought a Christmas. Like, I'm doing it now. Like, this is real adulting. Like, I'm an adult now.
Like, you're buying your own Christmas trees. What?
Like, that's where we are in our lives right now.
Yeah, wow. To new seasons, man. I was actually thinking about buying a Christmas tree, but I was like, I was thinking, what narrative? You know how you like over politicize everything? I'm like, what narrative am I? Yeah, so we have problems, guys. Nkosi, what was your first Christmas memory?
Oh, yeah. Well, so with Christmas, there's this one like constant experience, which I think even from my first to my current, there's this always this sense of abundance, spirit of sharing of meals. I might look at my plate during that time, like it's never as full like it's only during this time when especially on Christmas Day, where they put the plate, like I can literally hide behind my plate. And it never happens like in any other time. But I mean, I remember this one Christmas where I did not have clothes, like Christmas clothes. I mean, it always has that mixture of like this pain, but then there's also this sense of abundance that's there. But then also Christmas for me is always accompanied by, there's always those adverts when I was at school, when there's those back to school, back to reality, type. So they always gave me anxiety. And so there was always that sense. I hated school. And I mean, towards the 25th, or just on the 25th onwards, you'll get those adverts, ShopRite advertising, school stationery, school uniform. And then immediately in January, there's that sense of lack, where like we literally don't have anything, we're scrapping, fridges are empty, the bin without bread. I mean, so I mean, there's, and also that is constant, in my experience. So there's this abundance in December, then there's this lack in January. So for me, I mean, it all connects within that Christmas story, in my memory, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, the Kenyans in the group are really are smiling because we know we have, in Swahili, njaa is hunger, and so we know that January we jokingly say that it is in January, so it is a hunger-filled month. So I want to continue with you, Nkosi, and ask you about, because now we are thinking about Christmas, the first Christmas as read in the Gospels. What was it like when you read the scriptures? What was that story like? What was going on in that Christmas?
Yeah. I mean, reading about the story of Jesus, there's always this debate around, was he born in December? Was it the 25th? And all of those type of debates. I mean, for me, I always get the sense that literally, like the exact date of his birth, it's not of a debate here. But then the fact that he came, the fact that he was born, the fact that he lived, the fact that he taught, I mean, we can rely on those teachings. We can rely on this historic person. So for me, it always like, we can debate around those things, but they don't really matter. The fact, like which date he was born. I mean, for me, like what's more important, what has always been important is that he was born, he came. That young man came and then lived an exemplary life and then died. He was murdered, a death of a criminal. And so, I mean, I think those are important for me when it comes to that story. But strange enough, I remember I was given maybe 4 years or 5 years back, I was given the time to preach on that. I think I preached on John, but I don't think I will preach it in John if I am to be given that opportunity again. I think John spiritualized this story. I think I love the human person of Christ. I think I resonate with that person a lot than the spiritual being that John is introducing. Yeah, I'm not sure if that is, yeah.
That's great. Darius, what thinking about that very first Christmas? Same question. Like, what in your mind's eye do you see? What was it like? What the hidden story that's going on? What nuances do we miss in our current context?
I mean, looking back, for me, one of the big things is the fact that, especially being in a Catholic background, you walk into the space and they used to recreate that nativity scene, with the big cypress trees. Of course, they would put all these figurines in there. And the interesting thing about it is the fact that in many ways that recreates a certain symbolism in how you look at it. You given the story of course, you'll see the stars hanging there. You'll see the wise men. They always hang the three. I don't know why three. In that space they put the three figurines. Despite clear mention of that. The fact that there are three different type of gifts, but nobody talks about having the three wise men, which is something that's been addressed over and over the years. Of course, Mary and and Joseph and all these that is built around the reality. And in many ways, you look at it, and as Nkosi is mentioning, it has a certain, it carries, of course, there's the spiritual implications of you have this new birth in the community. Of course, as a kid, you don't get that part, but you see the fact that these people, especially there's a certain racial dimension that nobody ever addresses, that is just put in there, in terms of what is ascribed to have been the racial elements of those who are involved. Nobody ever mentions about the spirituality of the Magi and what it meant for them to be there, and the fact that they followed a star, and the fact that this is actually a manger, and stripped of all these nuances. It is a beautiful story caught up in a very celebrant mood, and in many ways some of the nuances, of course, lost includes a question you're saying about, what gifts were brought and what that meant for the baby. The fact that this was a manger, the indignity is stripped of the messiness of the moment is stripped off from this story, and it's just this beautiful reality with stars hanging from cypress trees, and we make it so beautiful in it, and there's definitely within that beauty, there's a certain complexity that never gets to be unpacked. And of course, as a kid, you don't confront that. But later on, as you grow and you get to interact with the scripture story, you get to, have these questions for yourself, when you get to interact with the stories in different spaces, whether in this season or even outside this season, in the reading of scripture, you get to see this and you get to assess of what does this mean? What does this mean for you here? What does it mean for you as a Kenyan? What does it mean for you as a person within this context? What does it mean for Jesus within Jerusalem, within the Judean community? What are these, different aspects of reality that speaks into the Jesus story? And beautifully so when looked at in the big picture, but cannot, or as for mission or commission, are never part of the nativity scene as it's recreated, especially in the church you unpack as you go later on. But at that point in time, all you see is this beautiful nativity scene recreated at a corner in the chapel, and that is all you get to interact with without all the hindsight of being an adult now and looking back and saying, this was beautiful, this could be rethought, this is not sure how to do this, or maybe there are certain things you'd want added in there that are part of this beautiful story. So there's the element of what you interact with at that point in time, and there's what you come to think about later on as you go. And all that, it's part of that redemptive story, redemption as a person, but also redemption of that story from how it is told, what can be included, what may not have told that story in an accurate way. So that all makes part of that story. And eventually, when you grapple with it, it becomes part of your story as a person. Yeah.
Thank you, Darius. Christine, the nuances, the hidden stories, the first Christmas, all of that.
For me, I think I'll begin with Luke's narrative. Luke chapter 2 begins with these like very heavy words that we skip over and we treat them as kind of the backdrop of the story when they are so rich and they have so much that we don't actually grapple with, which says that in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken in the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And so everyone went to their town to register. Until recently, I had never actually paid attention to those verses, that Jesus' birth is foregrounded by describing the governance structure that he was being born into, the political system that he was being born into, that in those days, Judea was a Roman colony, right? And if you read the Bible, the few times where a census is mentioned, a census is not really taken so that for service delivery. It's not really taken so that the governing authorities can govern better or can deliver government services. It's really taken for one of two reasons. In the book, I think of in the Old Testament, David took a census that God was not pleased with, because the purpose of that census was for him to count the fighting men, and so that he could feel assured of his military might and the security of his kingdom, right? But God always wanted him to rely on God, right? On the fact that the people of Israel were God's people for God's purposes, right? It wasn't because of this human kingdom situation that they had pushed God to allow them to have, right? It was never his intention for them to be under kings and expanding as empire. This imperialistic logics was never his intention, right? And this second time when what I've just mentioned, the opening verses of Luke 2, the Romans were not taking this census for benevolent reasons. It was basically to know what human capital there is in the empire for the purposes of taxation, exploitation, for all kinds of coercive tactics to extract as much as possible, right? And this is the context that Jesus is born in. Jesus could have been born at any other time in Israel's story. If at all he had to be born in that setting, among the people of Israel, he could have been born at any other time. He could have been born when Israel and Judah were still kingdoms, right? He could have been born while they were in exile in Assyria or in Babylon, or even when they came back and rebuilt Jerusalem, rebuilt the wall, rebuilt the temple, right? He could have been born in this intermediary period between the Old and the New Testament when there was so much revolt. But he was born at this particular time when the Romans were making moves to count the number of people who were in their empire so that they could know how much to expect in terms of taxes and extraction, right? So for me, like Darius says, the nativity story usually starts in a very soft, gentle way of angels appearing and saying that he will have a son, or of the shepherds, outside with their flocks, or even of the wise men looking for a star, watching the night sky, right? But this tells me that this story happened at a very dicey time, in Israel's history. King Herod was not really a king with that much executive power. He was kind of like a client figurehead of this Roman imperial structure, right? Who was allowed certain power, but really ultimately all power belonged to Caesar, right? And so Jesus is born in this very, very dicey and tricky situation where there are so many menacing forces against his life, not just from Rome, but from the Jewish authorities that were collaborating with Rome. And for me, I think that's something I hadn't really seen until fairly recently, when I started to be much more attuned to picking up this context of the Gospels. The context of the Gospels is something that I see jumping out at me so much more these days. And like Ngozi said, I think when you grow up in church or when you know like these Bible stories, for me, I tended to see Christ the figure a lot, Christ the symbol, right? I think because we're always reading with, you know, St. Paul's systematic theology influencing how we read the Gospels, for example, right? But until recently, I had never actually seen Jesus the man. I was familiar with Christ the figure, but not Jesus the man, right? And if you're introduced to Jesus through St. Paul's, through the majority of the New Testament, Jesus the human really doesn't show up that much, right? Jesus becomes an abstraction and becomes a symbolic, a symbol or a figure much more than a person. And so these days I'm looking for Jesus the person, you know? I see Jesus as a brother or a friend. When the scriptures call him Emmanuel, God with us, I'm truly starting to see that a lot, as a friend and a companion, as someone who is subject to all kinds of political machinations, just as I am, whose life is inscribed by menacing forces and by forces that, I mean, by power structures that are not always working in his favor or in my favor.
Thank you, Christine, man. I think for me, more and more, when we remove the political away from, when we remove the political setting and we don't heed when it says in the time of this and this king, because what that is helping us do is that it's giving us the political context and telling us and giving us the lay of the land. And when we remove the stories of scripture, the stories of origin, it's in Kenya, it's like saying someone, when we say someone was born in 1982, we know what was happening in 1982. There was a coup. When for South Africa, there was an attempted coup. For South Africans, when they say before 1960, in the 1960s, in the 80s, in the 90s, we know that there was a struggle for liberation. Everywhere, that context helps us. And when we quickly skip into the story, we lose the meaning, or we lose the weight of that social, political, economic story that is. So we are saying a naked story because we are not. It's not full. It's not complete. Once you just hop into the he was born, but we don't know that it's not important where, how, but that it is he was born. Yet it's very important for that context to be understood. Because we say a lot about, I think when we are in churches, I don't know if you guys do this, we always say that if Jesus was born today, where would he have been born? And for most of us trying to be politically correct, we try and say the informal settlements, but we really wish he wasn't. We really, really wish he wasn't born in informal settlements. But and then we also brush over the fact that the location that Jesus was born in was not where you would want to be born in, as Christine has said. But I was really interested in a post you did the other day about Jesus being born in Accra. And for Kenyans, a kraal is Zizi la Ng'ombe, a stable. And for this, allow us to pay homage to our Professor Vuyani Velam, who passed away a year ago. And he has this theology around the kraal. And he says that the kraal is the heart of the home, where the animals eat. Sleep is the heart of the home. And if you want to know that there's problems in a home, look at the kraal. And if there's grass growing in that kraal, there's trouble. But your premise, Nkosi, when you posted that was about the birth and the presence of women in the kraal. Would you share something about that?
Yeah. So yeah, maybe let me start with this.
Before you go on, Nkosi, would he have been born in Tembisa or Gauteng?
Where would Jesus be born? Tembisa or Joburg Central or Kylie
or Alexander? No, no. I mean, so that's why I actually wanted to go to entertain that idea. So in 2018, my twin girls were born on the 31st of December. And on the 1st of December, that the following year, which would have been 2019, then came these news headlines that a twin girl in Alexandra died. Like a day-old girl was killed by a rat. So was the twin sister slept next to her. The rat, I think, ate the head of this other twin. I think that imagery for me then changes this whole narrative. Maybe there's a possibility that Jesus wouldn't have even been born. Jesus might have died as a result of these conditions. He might have been eaten by a rat in Alex, in Kylie through a fire. You know, these things that constantly visits these areas. The condition of littering, I mean, the dirtiness of these areas, these unlivable conditions. Maybe Jesus might not even have lived up to that 30 years of age. The very conditions to which he would have been born in would have killed him. I mean, I think I'm entertaining that more. I mean, Steve Biko talks about this idea that it is a miracle to grow up in the township and survive up to adulthood. So if you're not killed by these horrible diseases, you will be murdered by criminals, or you are murdered by police. I mean, that's the reality of South Africa. You are constantly flirting with death. I think that's the life that Jesus would have lived. Maybe he would have died and been murdered as a teenage boy, or being eaten by a rat, or being born into these sick hospitals, you know, with no proper machinery to assist children. Or he would have been born as a from a doping mother. I mean, you know, there's still people who are paid through alcohol in Cape Town. So that doping system, maybe he would have been born as a child with Down syndrome, you know. So I mean, those are the ideas I want to entertain now, more than this Jesus who survives all of these tragedies. I want to see a Jesus who doesn't, and see what that imagination will take us. So I mean, with this idea of Jesus being born in the kraal, for me, like it speaks to this idea of access to services. You know, for Black people in South Africa, even the hospitals that are assigned to assist us if we are sick themselves. You know, you go to a hospital sick, then you come back more sick. I'm not even sure if I'm using the right English here, but you become sicker after attending a hospital because of the conditions that these hospitals are in, where there's lack of doctors, just like even the very conditions that these hospitals are in. In the Eastern Cape, there's even some that are like dripping with rain when it's raining. You know, those type of conditions. And so, I mean, this idea of then Jesus' mother has to then improvise. And then Jesus is born into a kraal, which really speaks to, I mean, when Jesus is born into that, really speaks, I mean, literally that kraal can be a hospital, a Khayelitsha hospital, which hosts about, I think there's about 2 million people in Khayelitsha. And that's the district hospital, which then has to carry this load. Imagine during the time of COVID, where there's literally no capacity to hold. And then there's alcohol added, which means every weekend, the trauma section is just filled with people. Even the beds are not there for people when they are sick to sleep in. So, I mean, that's literally the condition of a kraal, if you may. And for me, like that idea speaks to this improvisation that Black people has to constantly live with. Because, I mean, we live through improvising. Yeah, it's constantly a miracle to even live a day for us. Even when we go into these hospitals, we are constantly endangered. And so that idea of a kraal for me, like it speaks to this vulnerability. This child whose mother risks everything so that this child is born and tries all at her best to keep him safe. But then what does safety look like? Like in doing such a delicate thingy. When you're doing such like a delicate thing, and then you do it in such a dirty place, a kraal, like you are literally endangering both the life of the woman and the life of the child. But then also there's another aspect to it that speaks of Mary as this rebellious woman, as this Black radical feminist. Because for women, for the wives in our culture, they are not allowed into a kraal. Young wives are not allowed into a kraal. And on the basis that they are wives, they are young wives. But then also women in general, they are not allowed when they are in their menstruation, in their periods. So for me, this really speaks to Mary breaking all of those boundaries. If the kraal is such a spiritual place where there's this interaction between the living, the dead, and the gods of this family, why should there be people that are disallowed access into these spaces? So Mary, for me, then breaks that, both as a wife, but then secondly, as a woman who will bleed into this kraal. So she does away with all of these rules that are put into place as a way of oppressing some, you know. So yeah, I'm not sure if that, yeah.
Yay, Nkosi, you're turning tables, man. Turning tables. Thank you. I doubt that in any, like if you close your eyes and see the image of Mary that we have in our eyes, we do not see a radical woman. We do not see someone who is stepping out and claiming her position. We see a sanctified Mary. So, Christine, we are told that if Mary was to be born, she would be born in Kibera, in Khayelitsha, in Kibera, in Mathare, in, I don't know. What does that say? What does the birth and the location imply also to our context? Because that's the South African context. What does it apply and imply into our context?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much parallel to what Nkosi is saying, that these are the conditions that I think the least and the left out grapple with, right? And like I said, the whole province of Judea was part of the Roman Empire, not an esteemed part of the empire at all. And particularly where Joseph and Mary were from, which is the town of Nazareth. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but his parents were from Nazareth and he grew up in Nazareth, right? This was a town that was known as a hotbed of unrest, a lot of revolts against Roman rule. There were many, many rebellions in and around Nazareth. And I don't think it's, if we take Jesus as an actual historical figure, like someone who actually walked this earth in a particular place at a particular point in history, I don't think he would be untouched by that environment that he was in, being from a place that was known to be not just poor and marginalized, but also having very serious unrest and rebellions and revolts against the Roman Empire. Just a few years before Jesus is recorded to have been born, there was a major revolt in Nazareth, in a town right next to Nazareth called Sepphoris, which was the site of a Roman armory. They used to keep weapons under guard there. And these people from Nazareth and Sepphoris broke into the armory and stole weapons and were ready to fight the Romans and kick them out. But the rebellion failed. The town and the armory of Sepphoris was burned to the ground, and 2,000 Jews were crucified along the highways leading into and out of Nazareth as a sign to anyone who would try this again. But the people of Nazareth tried it again and again, which is why by the time Jesus begins his ministry, Philip is one of the disciples who is called, and he tells his brother, we have found the one who is called the Messiah. And I think it was Nathaniel, his brother, who said, really, Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Tells you that he was not from a place that was highly esteemed at all. Now, with the town of Sepphoris having been burnt to the ground, and we are told that Joseph was a carpenter and Jesus grew up as his apprentice as a carpenter. Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, do some work to build the city, right? Can you imagine Jesus there rebuilding some part of Sepphoris that had been burnt down, or doing some kind of, public works there, or being commissioned to supply something, that he had to be like intimately in contact with these political realities, right? Because he was from a place where you literally could not ignore it or slide past it or pretend that it didn't exist, right? That was not an option if you were born in the 1st century in Judea, in Galilee, living in Nazareth. This is not something that you could slide past, right? And for some of us, we have this thing of saying that, I don't even follow politics. I don't do politics. Politics is not my thing, right? I want us to realize that that's really coming from a certain layer and level of privilege for you to check out or to opt out, because there's some people for whom that is never an option. Politics comes to where you are. It knocks on your door. It breaks down your door, it stops you on the way home. It prevents you from making a living. It keeps you in a place that is undignified and dangerous. And so if you are, living in the kind of existence where you can opt out of caring about it, Jesus could not opt out of that because he was from Nazareth. And to the point where when he's literally beginning his ministry, that point about his story and his background, that he's from Nazareth, is the first thing that is raised about him.
Thank you, Christine. You know, the way we are told, I'm thinking of the motivational speakers who are always say, it doesn't matter where you came from, you will come from nothing to something. And that just really removes so much in terms of your nuances. It makes you believe that context does not matter. But Darius, I want you to help us think through what was going on economically, social, politically at that time of Jesus's birth. Who had the money? Who had the purse? Why the Christine talked about the census and why the census? What was the politics and the economics that was going on at that time in India?
I mean, it's interesting coming back to the conversation around context, and especially economic context, because you realize that this has been the Roman nation, not the Roman kingdom, then the nation itself, before it becomes an empire. So you get into the 1st century, and there's this sort of transition. We call it the Greco-Roman Empire, but basically it was the transition from the Greeks who drew this place from the times of Alexander the Great. And now you're seeing a transition into, the Roman Empire, as it were. And of course, those kinds of transitions carry with it a lot of symbolic realities, a lot of people shifting allegiances, a lot of shifts in terms of who gets to run this place. Also, let's remember that the Roman kingdom at this point is on a major expansion, basically, and they're getting all these monies coming in, trying to assimilate newer communities across all the way to Carthage, across all the way to Egypt. Part of it, they're also trying to get into Europe, into parts of Southern Europe, and build this major kingdom where they're able to collect as much as possible. So it's a period of myth making at the center in terms of who can be a Roman, who can get to own stuff in there, who can get to control resources. But on the fringes, it's a very volatile space where communities that are held, so for example, the Jews are kept in there. You look at some of the Germanic tribes that are being assimilated into the wider Roman kingdom. And there's, of course, a certain level of economic classism that goes into this that was never really in your face as you see it right now, because the racial element, of course, was there, but it isn't as defined as you look at it now, because when you look through the history of the Roman Empire, you realize that there are a certain number of, including Black emperors along the way. So that kind of assimilation model that they were working with had its sense of discrimination, but it was hidden behind the fact that there wasn't the kind of it wasn't a pigmented kind of discrimination. It was, do you belong to the empire as it were, and the ideals that it's trying to build in, starting all the way, with Caligula, you're building all across Augustus, Julius, Nero, along the way. Do you belong to this or you don't? And in many ways, it shapes a lot. You look at the temple itself and what the Jews had to offer the temple, what it meant for them to have to deal with an imposing kingdom. I mean, you can draw parallels, for example, for context to understand it. It's pretty much the same parallels you have with Kenya. You had the Black community, you had the people who had to be assimilated into the colonial infrastructure that we had here. But the ranks and the hierarchies were always very clear, at least within the context that these people were in. So, I mean, to just illustrate that with a point that comes way later on in Jesus's life and teachings, when this person is asking, should we, pay our taxes to these people? It's an oppressive kingdom. We are not seeing any services, as it were. We are not seeing any sense of dignity and justice for our people. And the question of taxes always in the background, including we're seeing even with Jesus' disciples. But most importantly, Jesus understands in how he responds when he says, give me a coin. He looks at the coin and says, okay, whose image is on this? They say Caesar. And he says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God. He's trying to draw something for them here. And one of the things that comes out clearly is basically if he's asking you whose image is on this and you're saying Caesar, it means whose image is on you. I mean, if you're asking, give to God what belongs to God and give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, he's talking about the fact that they have imposed a certain system here. It's a system that is being challenged. In many ways, it's a context that will have to shift along the way. But at this point, as you grapple with it, there are certain contextual and certain existential realities that even as you challenge them, you also have to acknowledge them as part of your wider reality. And we've had the conversation about context. And basically, he's telling them, give to God what belongs to God. And when he's saying give to God what belongs to God, he's basically giving them a sense that if you're going to give to God what belongs to God, and you're going back to Genesis 1:26, as he says, he made them in his image. So when you give to God of yourself, you're also giving your heart to God. You're also giving of your resources to God. So Jesus here is challenging them to consider the fact that there's a certain civic responsibility imposed upon them. It's not the most ideal. It's not, in fact, it's not anywhere close to an ideal civic imposition on the social, cultural, political, and economic realities. But he's also calling them to a higher ideal here that in as much as you have to acknowledge the certain civic mess you're caught up in within this context that you're in, but your ultimate allegiance is to God, that give to God what belongs to God. You have to give to God that which bears his image. And when you have to give to God of yourself, just like the church in Macedonia, your resources and your civic duty also gets to reflect that. And so in many ways, it was a messed up context. It was a context that, much as it didn't have the kind of racial complexities, at least as we acknowledge them now and over the past 400 years, there was a certain level of class dynamics built into it. And these class dynamics, of course, carried with them certain colonial and certain imperial overtones built into them. And Christ is calling them to a higher ideal here, that as much as you acknowledge this civic context, there's a temporalness to it, and there's a sense that you have to challenge them. But even as you challenge them, you have to challenge them with the right understanding that ultimately you are a people called unto God. And by being called unto God, you have to challenge this. You have to give of yourself to God. And by giving of yourself to God, you're also having to ask yourself, what then does that mean for our resources individually and collectively, and not just economic resources in terms of money and or the denarii as they call it then, but also of our time, of everything that we consider valuable or everything that they considered valuable, even at that point in time. So it is a time of economic expansion for the empire. It is a time of economic oppression for the people, especially for the for the Jewish people, but also for all the other communities that were surrounding Rome, especially the Germanic tribes. But it's also a call to a different model of looking at the spiritual responsibility and how that also shapes the civic responsibility of the Jewish people. Yeah.
Thank you, Darius, for setting that scene up for us. And I want us to think about for me, songs are very important, and we've been trying to set up to set up the context that this birth was happening in, and during Christmas, what you always recalling is that there are Christmas carols, there are songs that are sung. So all of us, we know, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. We know all those, like there are songs that ring. But there's a song that Mary sang. There's a song that Mary sang, and it's in Luke chapter 1, verse 46 to 55. And I want to read it because I want us to, for us to discuss about this song and contrast it with the songs that we sing now around Christmas. And speak about what it means. So as you're listening to what I'm singing, I'm reading, I can't sing to save my life. But if you can't, if contrast this to the Christmas carols that we know, I'm bursting with God news. I'm dancing the song of my Savior God. God took one good look at me and look what happened. I'm the most fortunate woman on earth. What God has done for me will never be forgotten. The God whose very name is holy, set apart from all others. His mercy flows in wave after wave on those who are in awe before him. He bared his arm and showed his strength, scattered the bluffing braggarts. He knocked tyrants off their high horses, pulled victims out of the mud. The starving poor sat down to a banquet. The colors rich were left out in the cold. He embraced his chosen child Israel. He remembered and piled on the mercies, piled them high. It's exactly what he promised, beginning with Abraham and right up to now. So when we hear, Nkosi, when you hear Mary's song, what do you hear? What's going on with Mary and her songs, and the songs we sing today around Christmas?
Yeah, maybe let me first start with talking about songs in general. I mean, here in South Africa, as you, I think when you, yeah, I mean, within your facilitation of this conversation, you mentioned around in the context of South Africa around the 60s, around the 80s. Now, one of the things that you'd find within that time is the reality of Black people not having the military power, the finances, I mean, to finance the struggle. They did not have literally anything to respond to the brute force of the state at the time. I mean, the few resources that they got were from countries like Cuba, other African countries that had already experienced independence, Russia, the left-leaning countries, China, and so on. And so, I mean, for me, then, like, it's always a question of what is it that sustained them. Now, one of the core things that you'll find, even with the videos that are on YouTube around that, is the singing. People are singing at that time. And some of the songs that they will sing are songs that will literally speak of revolution, but then two songs that will give them strength to continue doing what is right, even though they are dying. I mean, there's literally a song that sings, I mean, that speaks of that. Even if we may die, but we are going forward with the struggle. So, I mean, a song kind of becomes these wings that holds people during these troubled times. And now, one of the things that you will find, I mean, even with the well-recognized artists of South Africa, Miriam Makebas, and I mean, all of these Huma Sekelas and them, is that they sang songs that made sense to our struggle. Now, when you look at the post-94, like an artist and a musician in the post-94 era, you'll find that these are people that are lulling us into, you know, they're keeping us dormant and making us being fine with things as they are. And for me, I think there's always that with this song of Mary and these Christmas carols. These Christmas carols, I mean, literally, you can sleep when those things are playing, you know, which is literally the same as South African national anthem. That thing can't inspire anyone to do anything. That thing is very dangerous for Black people. And so you find us really singing these things, but they mean nothing. They're just keeping us where we are, making us fine with our pain. They make the black bodies to be hospitable to pain. But the Song of Mary kind of gives a possibility of this other world, a possibility of undoing this current world, a hope for a possibility for, new imagination, So for me, there's, and you'll find, one of the most interesting things around these songs is that all the songs that can wake us up into something, they are literally the marginalized, the silenced songs. Every artist that speaks into prophetically is silenced. Every artist that speaks prophetically, even in South Africa, they are silenced because they want us to hear all of these things that will, make us whatever we are currently. So for me, there's that around this Song of Mary.
Can I add on to that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add on to this, Mary's song is something that we actually never hear as part of the Christmas story. I've never been to a Christmas play, for example, that included the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, right? And in the very extreme rare instances that her song is included, it's usually just the first part of it, like just the first couple of verses of I Am God's Faithful Servant, But Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German pastor and theologian, executed by the Nazis, he called Mary's song the most passionate and perhaps even the most revolutionary hymn ever sung. Because, Carol, when you were reading it, the places where she's talking about righting unjust systems, right? Pulling down rulers from their throne, sending away the rich, but giving to the poor because they're in need, is something that in the context of what we've been talking about since the beginning of this conversation, in the context of the oppressive Roman Empire, of a very unjust social and economic situation that they were in, this was not a neutral or an innocent thing to say. To sing a song where you would say that rulers would be pulled from their throne, and this is during the rule of the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, as we saw in the beginning of Luke 2, someone who had transformed the Roman state away from a republic and now decisively into an empire, right? The Roman state before was ruled by, a coalition of senators and all that. Augustus's great uncle, Julius Caesar, amasses power for himself, becomes a dictator and a tyrant, is executed, but his nephew Augustus actually accomplishes what Julius Caesar had begun. And Mary is talking about rulers being pulled from thrones when Caesar Augustus is consolidating the empire. This is not like an innocent thing, right? Historically, even in today's world, right, in the contemporary moment, Mary's song has actually been banned, right? As part, there are congregations at certain points in time that have not been allowed to recite Mary's song as part of their liturgy. This has happened in India, it has happened in Guatemala, in Argentina, right? Because people in power recognize how, the depth of this song and what Mary is actually calling for, for actual, people, governmental rulers, to say that you cannot recite Mary's song in full as part of your liturgy, like this has happened in modern times, right? Is something that I think is just such a tragedy that we've never actually seen, right? The Magnificat Mary's song has been viewed as dangerous by people in power. And I think this is something that I think is worth looking at again and asking us, what would Mary sing today? What do you think would be the content of her song today? what are the things that are unjust that need to be righted? And when Mary gets to know that she's going to have this child whose destiny is so dangerous to the people in power, this is the song that she sings, and I wonder today, what would the content of her song be like?
So maybe we should be asking, what would Mary sing? You know, like, and what would be, and are we singing those songs? Darius, more and more, like as we are talking about this, we see that there's a sanitization and a commercialization of the Christmas story. And it's not, like, we all know that some of those things, that this is not an accident. Commercialization, cleaning that story is not an accident. Maybe you can draw onto the songs and also speak about the sanitizing and commercialization of the Christmas story and of the birth of Christ, and what effect and impact that has on the Christian story and the Christian narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because instead of asking what Mary would sing right now, you're asking Mary, did you know? Either way, you know, it's an interesting space because part of the commercialization of the Christmas story, commercialization is a very classist reaction. It's a very classist model of handling of society. And the classism, of course, feeds into the wider imperial reality that this story has been rescued from its elements, its humanity, its contexts that speak into the everyday reality. I mean, when I read Magnificat, one of the things that stands out for me generally is, well, I would say three things. You know, there's time, there's promise, and there's context. You know, there's time in terms of the fact that they're saying, you know, this will, you know, herald the end of rulership for certain people. It will end for, you know, certain rulership and certain dominions. It speaks of promise for especially those who are in the margins of this reality, in the margins of what is considered the main story, the main, should I say, imperial story, you know, in human history. Is offering this sense that there is going to be an alternative and there is going to be time, but also there is going to be transitions, and a lot of it in there. And in many ways, it's an offer of hope. It's an offer of the people who, for once, the story has never been about them. Both, you know, you look within the Jewish community, within the Roman reality, within the wider margins of the empire. And there are a lot of these people who, for them, the desire for relief, the desire for something that is different. They're asking, are you the Messiah? You know, when the John's disciples are asking, are you the Messiah or should we wait for somebody else? Of course, they're asking in context of what happens to John and, you know, him being in jail. But that is definitely a question for a lot of the people, a lot of the listeners, a lot of the hearers. And in many ways, this commercialization that has happened over the years, it's an entrenchment of part of, should I say, the co-opting of the Christian story into the wider imperial story. That is, it becomes this nativity scene, neat, classist, elitist, if you will, robbed of the human nuances that defined everybody else. Number one, who even at that point in time did not fit into that classic story, but for whom the entire Jesus story offers a new way, you know, a new redemption for them. It offers a new promise for them. It offers a new hope. So looking at that, at Jesus, at Mary's song at this point, we definitely understand why it will be banned in some of these spaces. It challenges authorities, it challenges class, it challenges identities as currently constructed, you know, in many spaces across the world. It challenges norms, it challenges, you know, it brings to the fore the stories and that in many ways would be considered taboo, the stories of those in the margins, the stories of those for whom in any other context, their reality would not be considered as part of a significant story of both the Jewish and the Roman realities. And they're basically saying, in this song Magnificat, you're saying these rulers will be challenged. The people for whom are in the margins of this reality will definitely get the voice, will get the hope that Christ comes to represent for them. And in many ways, of course, that it challenges, including the stories we tell ourselves. I mean, when you ask Mary, did you know? When you look at the Christmas songs that we sing now, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, but also with certain presumptions that in many ways we could be forgiven for some of them, but also in many ways could not be held by people who were there then and for whom the coming of Christ was an amazing story in every sense of the word, and the challenge, and because of what it just meant for them to exist in that space. So reading through that story, those are the things I see. I see time, that the challenge Christ offers, or the hope of, and the promise of Christ offers, is something that is going to play out not just within that time that he is coming in, but across a very lengthy time period. We see a promise to a lot of people, and we see the sense that transitions are going to come, and these transitions will always happen across very, varied contexts. The classes, the political, the commercial story that now has become much of the reality that we have to deal with. So I see those things. I see time. I see promise. I see transitions in that song. Yeah.
Carol,
here. Yeah.
one last thing is that this passage by Mary is the longest stretch of words spoken by any woman in the New Testament. We are told that the women witnessed and testified when Jesus rose from the dead. The Easter story, we are told that the women testified, but we never get to hear their own words. How did they say it? But in this passage, this is the only place in the New Testament where a woman speaks for an extensive, passage. It's the longest one spoken, the longest words spoken by any woman in the New Testament. And look what the woman is saying. She's talking about the rulers being pulled down from their thrones. She's talking about the rich being sent away. She's talking about the poor being satisfied, right? She's talking about God making the unjust ways of the world just again. And like Carol, you began with this video about Msingi Trust that talks about justice and righteousness are the foundation of his throne. And basically, this is what this woman in the New Testament, the only place where a woman gets to speak for herself in her own words extensively. This is the content of what she has to say. And I think that's worth noting.
Man, they did us a number when they silenced women in the Bible, guys. So I'd like to read some comments from people on Facebook Live. Please, guys, keep writing, putting your comments, asking your questions. Harriet says, I used to put up the tree in November as well, but this year I've tried rationalizing it, and so far I can't come up with a reason to put it up. We have so much going on with COVID, just trying to keep alive that the festivities just don't feel the same. Charles Minor says the political and social context of the first Christmas not given much attention. We then miss a lot of the implication of the birth of Christ and how consequential his life must be. Jackie Othiambo and Wanjiko Mwangi are quoting Nkosi, saying that songs that make, and affirming what Nkosi was saying, that songs that make Black bodies hospitable to pain, songs without possibilities, songs without new imagination. Christine, there's a question for you. No, she's quoting what you've said. In light of the revolutionary tone of the Magnificat, what would Mary sing today? Charles says, whatever the song, it would be censored and banned, and the singer would probably be executed. That has been the fate of prophetic voices that attempt to give us a new imagination. I am looking at our time, and I'm seeing that our time is far much gone, but I'd like us to tackle two elements quickly. One, I'd like us to talk about the silenced elements of the Christmas story. There's a genocide that happens. There's a fleeing to Egypt. Just as we were talking now, I was actually thinking maybe the first language that Jesus spoke was an African language. Because if he came here, the first tongues he had were African tongues. And right now, in Nigeria, we have 600 boys abducted by Boko Haram. Those silenced elements of the Christmas story, that we don't say. From the song, there's the genocide that happens, there's the seeking refuge that happens. Why the silencing? I can ask Nkosi to talk about that.
Yeah, the silenced elements of the Christmas story. I mean, especially through this time of genocide, there's this the Raquel who's refusing to be silenced. What does it say? Because of their
I know what you're saying, Rachel.
Yeah.
The cry, there's a bitter cry,
yes,
drama, because
yeah,
Rachel
refusing to be silenced.
Refuses to be silenced. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think, or maybe, yeah, I think there's always this idea of celebrating this Jesus who survives. But for me, I mean, there's also like the other question to that. What will Jesus have said when he's being told that actually when you were born, the empire was threatened such that we had to run away with you. And then there's this many children who were murdered as a result of your birth. Like, what would have been the reflection of Jesus? Praising God for his safety, or really mourning and recognizing the brutality of a system that can take away life at any time it wills, you know? So there's always that, which I mean that is a reality of like within spaces of oppression, where there's some who makes it, there's some who can't make it. Then there's this praising of God in that, which for me I always find very like a bit problematic. It does not sit well with me to talk of God in that manner. Yes, I do recognize and realize that there's some kind of a miracle to survive the life of the township. But also I don't think we should speak of it in that manner. So for me, I mean, there's that element which really speaks to this brutality and this cruelty of the system. And then there's the part where there's this woman, Raquel, whose son has been like refusing to be silenced because their children have been murdered. I mean, I think of the context of the US, where Black young men are hunted, you know, to be murdered by police. I mean, within that context, I'm sure women, which in most cases you'll find that they're single women raising these young men. Like, is there a possibility that we can draw theology from those perspectives of women to take us or to bring us into a place where we want fear to lament what is currently happening in the world? Of course, within that lament, I mean, I think, I'm not sure which years it was. Was it around 2012 when the same Boko Haram took about 250 young girls? I I mean, I remember African officials were raising placards, also saying, "Bring back our girls." I mean, those type of things for me, like they speak to this kind of a defeatedness of Black people. Sorry. I'm in someone's office, so yeah. So yeah, let me check your question again. Yeah, I mean those elements of genocide, which in some ways still do find expression within our society, where young Black men are still a threat to this system. Actually, Black people in general are still a threat to the system. Like, why would a policed, like heavily armed old man like see fit or feel threatened by a young boy, like just minding their own business in the, like, roaming the streets? I mean, recently here in South Africa, there's a boy with who was like a young boy who was murdered because police felt threatened by this. So I mean, there's those things that yeah, just lie in there, and I don't think we do much to think of those things theologically, such that they give us tools to kind of bring about maybe new imaginations. Yeah.
Wow, thank you, Nkosi. Christine, I want to reflect on two things. Yeah, I'm thinking you talked about we were talking about Mary, but I'd also want you to reflect a bit on the shepherds that shared the story. Until recently, I think it's in Howard Thurman's book, or yeah, I think there was, I'm not sure which book. Like, I get so confused with books, but was saying how that a shepherd telling a story was akin to nobody telling you a story. And so when the message of the risen Christ, no, of the born Christ, the witness, the first people to witness, to be told of the birth, to witness, are quote unquote nobodies. That, and then that story is hidden from the king. That should tell us a lot. That should inspire us to think about who really holds the story of Jesus. Like, who is the one that Jesus wants to witness to that story. But we see that in the beginning of his life and at the end of his life, his witness is by quote unquote nobodies. What do we say about that?
Yeah, for me, what comes to my mind is who gets to speak, right? Who gets to witness? Whose testimony matters? In the Jewish tradition, they had these very elaborate rules about who could be a witness and how much their testimony counted, and how there needed to be corroborating witnesses telling the same story. You know, it was very, very intricate, right? The way testimony was handled, right? For me, I just, Carol, you said something that is so profound, that the witnesses to Jesus' birth were shepherds, and the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection were women. I mean, he does not, his life is not being witnessed by the people who are listened to, right? By the people who matter when it comes to testimony, to witnessing, right? I just want to, I know we're coming to the end of our conversation, and for me, I want to throw this way far into the New Testament, into a verse that I have recently been grappling with a friend of mine, which is in Revelation 12. In Revelation 12 is kind of a symbolic retelling of, this Jesus story, where there's a woman who's giving birth and a dragon is kind of hovering around waiting to devour the baby, right? Very much parallel to Jesus' birth at the beginning of the Gospels. And there's this verse in Revelation 12 that we all know and we talk about a lot, that those who are called by him overcame they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. We all know that verse, right? And growing up in Protestant evangelical circles, that was interpreted in a very clear way. It meant that if you're born again, then you should always say that I am Christine and I am born again and I love Jesus as my personal savior. That was what testifying was all about. But in the context of this imagery being painted in Revelation 12, and in the context of what we've read about Jesus' life, I don't think it's as simple as that. I don't think this witnessing or this testifying is all about saying, I'm Christine and I'm born again. It has more to do with being able to witness and testify in the sense of telling the truth, right? That is what makes us overcome these oppressive systems, is being able to testify or to witness and to call them out, to call them out by condemning, their inherent injustice by speaking the truth about what's happening, right? And for me, that aspect of witnessing is not just about, these quick slogans that we throw around, but it's really about telling the truth about what we are seeing. And that is the way to overcome, right? To overcome these systems that make oppression so ordinary that it's not even worth describing. It's not even worth mentioning, right? It's kind of completely taken for granted to this point where we even lose language to describe what we are seeing because it has been normalized, as Darius has been saying, that certain oppressions are so normalized that they're almost like the air we breathe. But when we speak the truth about them, that is where we can overcome. And just to tie this to that first part of that verse that says they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, we focus so much on Jesus' death as redemptive, right? We focus so much on that, that moment where he lost his life, and we read something redemptive into that, right? But a lot of times we don't realize that Jesus' death was not the thing that was ultimately the most redemptive thing. It was his life. He didn't just come onto earth to die, but he also lived. He lived for 33 and a half years. And for 3.5 years, his ministry did certain things. He had certain work that he did in the world, right? And the reason why the blood of the Lamb has power, it's because the life of Jesus had power. Book of Leviticus tells us that the life of the body is in the blood, right? So the blood has power because the life had power. You know what I'm saying? The life of Jesus did certain things in this earth, right? He was moving a certain way in the world. And when we look at Jesus' life, which begins with his birth, like we've been saying, and is the whole center of the Christmas story, then we can see his death as something that did not just happen incidentally. Like Jesus was not just supposed to come onto the earth and for him to shed his blood, right? He was actually executed by an unjust state. He was framed. The witnesses were unreliable. People were paid to betray him. I mean, like he was the victim of a very unjust trial and system, right? And when he lost his life and God said that Jesus will not remain in the grave, but will be raised to life, kind of condemned that unjust system by bringing out how inherently unjust it is. What am I saying? The short answer is that witnessing and testifying, right? Speaking the truth about what we are seeing, just as the shepherds did when Jesus was born, and as the women did when Jesus was raised from the dead, is actually what gives us the victory, that this victory has to be contextualized. You know, it has to be grounded in what was going on at the time, and especially in Jesus's life. I'll close by saying this. You know, some of us in our denominations and our faith traditions, we recite, I think it's the Apostles' Creed, or which has this line that says, Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. And then the next line says, he was suffered under Pontius
Pilate, was crucified,
dead,
died, and buried.
Third day he rose again. Do you see how Jesus' life is not even mentioned there? Like, he was born of the Virgin Mary, and then he suffered under Pontius Pilate, and then he died. You know, where is Jesus' life in that? What did Jesus do on earth? You know? And I think for me, rereading this and always actively trying to see his life, trying to see who he was when he was alive and what he did, right? And not always rushing for the systematic and symbolic and very abstract idea of the cross, right? As a redemptive moment, but instead seeing it as inherently unjust and unfair. The Gospels go to pains to explain that Jesus did not deserve to die, right? And I hope we never slide past that in the rush for this salvation that is actually not grappling with Jesus' life and his killing, right? It was a murder. It was worth grieving. It was worth lamenting, right? It was a tragedy. Jesus' death was actually a tragedy.
Christine, man, there's so much to grapple with. And Darius, I want you to be a witness in the words of Christine and in the words of the scripture. What is going on? How is Christmas in 2020? What's in our baskets? What really is happening to us? Socioeconomically, how different is it? And I'd like you, as you're saying that, you give your closing comment also after that, and then we'll have Nkosi and Christine share their closing comments. But before, maybe before you do that, no, you can answer that, then I'll read the comments from the peeps.
Thank you. I think for me, it goes to, just what Christina's mentioned about the redemptive aspect of the Jesus story, especially how he lived amongst his people. And you'd look at 2020, I always say one of the bigger elements, and especially in my field of socioeconomics, is sometimes it's so easy to get lost in the numbers and forget that the numbers tell a human story. When Christ is talking about, helping this person grapple with the story about, do we pay tax, to Caesar, it's a question of value, it's a question of time, it's a question of what is valuable to them at that point in time, and how does that tie into how they get to be devout in their life to God. And looking at 2020 and just generally looking at Christ's story, in many ways, it's been a hard year. Taking at where we are. But then you look at the Christ we follow. We look at the Christ that we follow and look up to. And you see a story that is always about those on the margins. And this is the one year that in many ways has not just amplified the challenge of those on the margins, but it's also dragged a lot of people into that spaces. And in many ways, it's, socioeconomically speaking, widened the gap between the haves, the think haves, as we say, and the have-nots, And in many ways, in that also means, what does it mean for the people who exist in our communities, in our church communities, in the villages that we are going back to, even in the online spaces that we exist in, who have to grapple with a very challenging reality that is worsened by a capitalist system that we've tried calling out, and we keep calling out in many ways, and we keep calling out the newer ways in which it tries to entrench itself in the community. So in many ways, the parallels between our realities socioeconomically and what happens to Christ are there. And in many ways, this challenges also how, I mean, the imperial story is still there. We're still having to deal with the capitalist structures here. In many ways, you still have to deal with the peoples on the margin. We still have to deal with the isolating model in which this modern model of economic production, but also how we look at, you know, people's labor, both the dignity of their labor, but also remuneration of their labor is handled in this world. We still have to grapple with the reality of taxes as a country, especially coming up in January. I mean, the parallels to Christ's reality when he's coming into the world and where we exist in 2020 and what that means for us as believers to step into that space, both within the context and abstractions to call out these spaces, but also within the human story to be able to say, how are we there for the people in our local communities, in our local churches? As we say within the evangelicals, how we get to be the hands and the feet, you know, how do we get to be those witnesses? So in many ways, and that's a part of, you know, pretty much my closing remarks, that when you look at the parallels of the Christmas story in the first century and the context within which we live right now, and the things that Mary sings about in the Magnificat, and how timely and prescient and necessary it is at this point we live in, it's, I don't know, it is overwhelming, to be honest. And it still means that Christ's story gets to be retold again and again and again. And we have to tell it in a way that ensures that the people who have always been in the margins, and we've spoken about that, the people whom the current context and realities has pushed to the margins, and the people who it has made vulnerable, still need our voice to be able to call out there as our duty to Christ, to be able to say the least and the lost and those on the margins are still part of Christ's redemptive story from his birth, through his life on earth, through the lives he's touched, through the norms that and context that he challenged, all the way to his dying, and even the, you know, as we look forward to his coming back. All this story, the parallels are all over for us, and the work has never been, should I say, still more urgent and more necessary as ever before. Yeah.
Asante sana Darius. Nkosi, final words, closing remarks.
No, thank you so much, Carol. Yeah, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating conversation. I would really love to look into the work of both Christine and Darius. You really, yeah. Yeah, I don't think I want to say anything more than that. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Nkosi. Thank you. Christine?
I think for me, I would just close it there. We've said so much today, but I'm so eager and keen to see Christmas in, you know, with this new light, with this new framing. I'm excited to begin to reframe Christmas this way. It energizes me. It gives me lightness and new hope. I want to close just by talking about the Christmas tree. Someone said, I think it's you, Carol, who said how you're overthinking this tree idea. I just want to say that trees are not white. Like, trees don't belong to this. I mean, you know, if you feel, for me, this is what I'm saying, feel like doing the tree, it's your tree, you know, it's your tree. Trees don't belong to the Western world. You can do a tree and just release yourself and celebrate.
And then I'll put cotton wool and make it snow.
Exactly.
Because that's what you
make it snow.
It's all right. Okay. I will think about getting a tree, but also I'm thinking now this is commercialization. All right. I will step into Joy and get a tree. Actually, I'll get a tree for my niece because she's the one who wants the tree. So do you have anything else? I'd like to read a few comments from the people and say kwaheri to everybody. So there are more questions. Are you good? Okay. So there are questions, and I think the reason I want to end with questions is so that we know that this story is not finished. Like, let's live in the text of scripture. Let's live in the nuances that we see, and let us retell the story and live the story afresh and anew with new eyes. Let's not go back to the commercialized the curated Christmas story. So there's a very interesting question here from Wanjiro Mwangi, who says, Jesus lives, and at what cost? How about the sons who die? Mary has a son, at what cost? How about all the mothers whose sons are killed? Who determines who lives and who dies? How does God do that choosing? How does he decide which death brings him honor and which brings him glory? And also from Wanjiko, reflecting on another conversation we are part of together. It's like, excuse me, smelly shepherds, who do you think you are to even open your mouth and have the divine name come out? So those are the things, the shepherds. Let's remember the shepherds, that the people at the margins whom had no voice are the ones who Jesus orchestrated, so that they are the ones who witnessed this momentous life-giving episode of life. And so let's live a Christmas that's merry, in the terms of that it witnesses, it bears witness to the real life, to the joys, to the sorrows, to the pains, to the highs and the lows. So to our Facebook family, kwaherini. See you next month. Every third Thursday of the month, we have a Facebook Live conversation. Please share this conversation with friends who've not been able to see it. They all save to the Msingi Trust page. Asanteni sana and kwaheri.